Welcome to another Democratic Future by DemocracyNext. I'm Lucy Reid. In this episode, I'm joined by Saad, Eddine, Saad and David Jubb, the co-founders of Citizens in Power. Citizens in Power is a not-for-profit company that works with networks, organisations and governments who want to explore and develop approaches to citizen-led governance and leadership through deliberative democracy, so using sortition, deliberation and rotation of power. Saad is also CEO and Artistic Director of New Art Exchange in Hyson Green in Nottingham. NAE is the UK's largest gallery dedicated to contemporary visual arts from the global ethnic majority. And it's also the first cultural institution worldwide with a permanent citizens' assembly as a key part of its leadership structure, the Voice Assembly. We discuss what inspired David and Saad to launch Citizens in Power, the successes they've seen across the UK, and how deliberative democracy is being used in arts and cultural organisations, in particular at NAE. The limitations that are in our current structures, and where to start if you're an organisation who wants to try this out. This interview is a part of our ongoing podcast series, interviewing those working in the deliberative democracy space and showcasing voices that we think you'll enjoy hearing.
It's so great to have a chance to have this conversation with you both. And before we launch into deliberative democracy and citizens in power, I'd love to hear a little bit about how the two of you met.
Great. Back in 2017, 2017, we both met working at Battersea Arts Centre. And obviously back at the time, BAC was doing a lot of work around co-creation. I'd say they were leading that conversation nationally. So naturally, David and I had many chats around co-creation, leadership, what is needed in the cultural sector. We both came from very different backgrounds and upbringing, but that kind of interest held that relationship until today, 10 years later.
10 years?
Around that, yeah, man. We are aging quickly.
Some of us more than others.
Nice. And so after 10 years, like what was it that inspired you then to build and create Citizens in Power? And can you perhaps also just describe a little bit about what is Citizens in Power? Why does it exist?
Yeah, so Citizens in Power is Saad and I working together to, as it says on the tin, really, explore how citizens can lead decision-making processes. And I think for all the reasons that Saad said, in terms of the cultural sector, we felt that things didn't change fundamentally. A lot of talk, cultural sector is so good at talking about change, but actually not a lot changed. And so Citizens in Power is essentially an organisation that is there to support other practitioners, organisations, funders, local government, national government to think about, particularly in and around the cultural sector, because that's our home sort of turf. That's our network. That's where we've worked all our lives, to support people to think about how they might do that. Just because this is like and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but it's such a different way of working. And we've often reflected on the fact that we sort of feel like we've almost had to rewire our brains or rewire the way that we go about doing things, that we sort of felt that there was a gap, it was needed. There was a need to have some kind of support network which could help people who were interested in doing this to come together. So that's, in a sense, in a nutshell, that's how Citizens in Power came about, and it's also what Citizens in Power is.
And just to add to this, I think also like the gap of COVID was an important gap that helped us boost this conversation and feel that we needed to act on it. I think we've seen so much great work, engagement and participation and co-creation, and we had the feeling that while this was celebrated during that period, it was, the conversation was going to quickly move to what it was pre-COVID, and it did happen. And I think, yeah, maybe that is the time where we felt, okay, we really need to go forward with that conversation and build a foundation that will support this work to don't quickly disappear again.
That makes a lot of sense. And so I'm guessing that, so you talk about the time at Battersea Arts, you spotted some gaps. You obviously pushing at something that felt not quite right or that could be different. And then sort of fast forward to post-COVID, when you kind of work out that Citizens in Power there's a space, and that Citizens in Power could help to build that space. How did you discover, and where did you discover deliberative democracy as being the thing that might actually shift that thinking around leadership and the rewiring of your brains? What moment did you become aware of it?
I'm sure that was different for both of us. For me, I had started to sort of be more aware, I guess, of the idea of citizens' assemblies probably in the early 2010s. And when the 2016 assembly, lots of people talk about, happened in Ireland on constitutional rights, which included sessions focusing around abortion, and that led to a law change. I think for me, I suppose having grown up watching the news about that specific topic and about the entrenched debate and nature of that debate and the sort of stuckness. I'm obviously speaking as somebody who's not from Ireland, but just observe, I suppose as a kid growing up and observing things on the news and sort of what I suppose having an inner sense of frustration that so little seemed to change. There's these moments of kind of, like the Berlin Wall coming down, or these huge kind of seismic moments. But so often it's really hard to identify in the way that we try to go about making change without revolution. In other words, peaceful change, that sometimes it doesn't happen. And with that topic, it really did happen, and it led to a law change. And for me, that was the moment of kind of going, wow, this is a different way of working. This can actually bring people together, and I wanted to find out about it. So I sort of was loosely aware of them, and that led me to really wanting to find out more about them. And so led to a kind of, as you do, looking online, watching this YouTube video or watching a bit of, there's so little at that time as well, really available information. And so it led to those. And Saad and I were having conversations about, particularly as he says, during COVID. And I think a key moment for us during COVID as well was, as Saad says, there was all this optimism again of kind of possible change, and all this focus on the organizations that were and had been for decades working with their communities, working in partnership with their communities, led by their communities. And then suddenly this £1.57 billion investment is announced by DCMS and literally acts as a deep freeze to kind of freeze the cultural sector in its old conventional model. And then all the focus came off all of those amazing organizations that were doing that fantastic work and just reverted to all the organizations that were obviously, understandably really struggling, but the whole narrative just shifted. And that was another kind of classic example of how the language and the debate and the dialogue seems positive, but then fundamentally the thing that actually makes difference is the money, and the money was backing the old model. And so that was also, I think, a really key thing for us. It's just this frustration around, that lack of change.
And how about for you, Saad?
For me, well, it is a search on how you kind of enact change, and going through maybe a key moment where that question grew in my mind was around 2011 with the Arab Spring. Obviously, I was living in Morocco, and that was my daily reality and connected really to the region. And it's a growing question around how do you enact change that is long lasting. And I guess that question grew in my mind for many years. And the first time where I sat down to really start researching, are there any models, are there any stories there that are more successful, was probably when I experienced the divide of Brexit. And was watching the TV. It was in my early years in the UK, and I just found that so fascinating. How how a question articulated in a certain way can create generational divide, and you kind of like see that within families, within teams, and I felt like there must be something out there. And yeah, like David, just going online and researching, and then up discovering the citizen assemblies, and wow, they've been going around for decades, and they work, and they're amazing, and they're that tremendously powerful tool that you can use to bring communities, to bring people together through divide. And yeah, that stayed in the back of my mind. Again, we reconnected through COVID, and it felt that the need was always there. To me, COVID felt like there is maybe just some momentum. And if we don't capitalize on that momentum at great pace, then we'll probably lose the opportunity for decades to come. And obviously, looking at how the conversation is developing now, 3-4 years later, I think he was right. And we were doing that on our corner, and then opening that conversation and discovering that there are so many pots all around the country that were starting that conversation. So yeah, it's just really, really exciting. It still feels unbelievable when I remember that first connections during COVID and where we are now. It was right, the momentum was there, and time for change is now.
Yeah, and both your examples are really interesting. So something really seismic and sort of cataclysmic happening, and what's the underpinning infrastructure or different type of institution from the traditional ones that actually provides all the scaffolding and the way to enable that change to happen. And maybe that's where we can go next, is thinking about the sort of principles of citizens' assemblies. So, sortition, deliberation, rotation of decision makers, and it'd be great to hear a little bit about. You've got some core principles that are sort of the core to citizens in power. So I think you talk about authority giving, the civic lottery, so the sortition process, and deliberation. And was it really easy just to decide on those because they're the kind of core components of a citizen assembly? How did you kind of decide that those are going to be your overarching core, kind of the core of citizens in power?
I think it was through conversation, and I think, to your question, I think sortition and deliberation were givens, because it feels like whenever people talk about citizens' assemblies, they're absolutely it feels like they're the kind of primal ingredients that without it isn't a citizens' assembly.
Yeah.
The reason why I think we developed authority gathering as a third, and it's sort of, perhaps it isn't a sort of as named. In an authority gathering in itself is a kind of slightly clumsy phrase, so it doesn't have that kind of simple name, is because we felt that one of the weaknesses of assemblies and juries was often that they kind of landed like spaceships. A question was devised, a team was put together, a brilliant, deliberative process was run after an excellent sortition process, but that actually, what was the impact, or what was the change that actually led to? And obviously, there's been good research to show that lots of the citizens' assemblies and juries that are held by local authorities do have generally good levels of response. But we felt that there was massive room for improvement in terms of that. And so we like this idea of authority gathering. If you're essentially going to hand authority, whoever it is, whether that's a local authority, whether it's a large organization, whether it's a government department, if you're going to hand authority over to a group of citizens to come up with answers, recommendations, plans, actions on a particular question, then essentially, on whose authority do you do that? Do you have the power to actually deliver on what you're asking citizens to deliberate on? And sometimes it feels like the answer to that, probably in retrospect, is not really, and sometimes you can see that in hierarchy. Maybe it's like a director of an organization is the person who's leading the assembly, but does the chair and the CEO of that organization absolutely fully buy in and has completely committed themselves and the organization's strategic plan to delivering on those actions? And obviously you can extrapolate that in terms of government, because it's also the fact that it's the reason why we like the phrase gathering is that often it's not just one actor. It could be an organization or it could be a government department, but actually in reality with society, the way everything works now, everything is a web, everything is interconnected. And if you're going to ask a question like everyone here does in West Cumbria, how does everybody enjoy creativity together in West Cumbria? Then, that's a multiple actor question. Or if you're going to ask in the West of England a question like how can culture and creativity be for everyone in the West of England? If you're going to ask a question like that, that requires hundreds actually of organizations to be engaged with a level of commitment to seeing through what citizens come up with. And so we felt it was really important. And actually, a lot of the work that we've done or supported on projects is a lot of it's been in advance of the assembly.
Yeah.
The assembly is only as good as the foundations or the authority gathering, if you like, that it's built on. And also, if you authority gather, I mean, in a sense, there's also a fourth stage that we always bang on about, which is also the aftermath too, which is what happens afterwards. What's the citizen-led structure to help deliver the outcomes or oversee the outcomes or continue to support the actors and hold them to account? And also sometimes because assemblies come up with great plans and recommendations, but inevitably sometimes they need nuancing or things change or events happen. And so what does that mean now? And so essentially having that long advance into the citizens' assembly and then that long follow through after the assembly feels just as important as the actual assembly or jury itself. So that's why I think that's sort of why we settled on authority gathering. Is that right?
Yeah. I think also that it was quite important in our early conversations to articulate and put some principles that allow for accountability. And that maybe come from a constructive critique around co-creation and what weakens co-creation, what weakens generally participation, and trying to allow all players to be quite clear in terms of what the framework needs, that allows to protect citizen-led decision making and allows also some accountability between cultural institutions and overall funders, investors, people or institutions who are resourcing this work. Because one of the risks is when you start similar movements, there is a moment where we're hoping that this conversation is going to become mainstream. And we want to ensure that the principles don't get watered down and become just a tool for fundraising, just a tool for PR, and just a tool to build narratives. So it needed to be really, really embedded in something that is super clear, that allows accountability, and that allows just clarity.
Yeah, and actually, it's really interesting when the commissioner, let's just for this instance call it one commissioner, is in that process of commissioning the assembly. Actually, one of the challenges is they're commissioning usually a facilitation or deliberation specialist organisation to deliver the process, and there is a lot of focus on the process because it is quite complex and it has a lot of layers to it, and there are certain things you need to do to make sure it really feels legitimate and has authority. But the beginning, as you say, the preamble and the tail are incredibly long, and they are, and also an organisation doing this for the first time hasn't necessarily got the support or the hand-holding, I guess, which is part of what Citizens in Power does, to think through the repercussions of what this actually means in terms of power and decision making, but also that aftercare of the citizens, because we know if you've been involved in one of these things, you're going to come at the end of it, you're going to have a room full of people who want to help you deliver that purpose and who want to know that you're going to do it. It's usually one of the first questions that gets asked is, are you going to do the things that we, the citizens, are recommending to you? And we've touched a little bit on co-creation, and for me, I'm very interested in this, because the arts and cultural world is very good, often at doing some really amazing participatory work. There are scales of that. It's also quite good at saying it's doing the sort of ladder of engagement and all those sorts of things. But I think one of the really interesting things is hearing from you a little bit about how that power dynamic shifts, and how CEOs or senior leaders or people who are commissioning these things can, what's the shift that needs to happen to understand that transfer of power piece, and how is that different from some of the other forms of participatory or co-creative or co-curatorial practice that you've come across?
But to be honest, I think that they're very similar in terms of co-creation, and I think it hasn't happened with co-creation. And what Saad was alluding to, I think, is a real problem I mean, obviously, this conversation, we're talking largely about the cultural sector because that's our sort of territory, but I think this probably relates more widely and extrapolates to other sectors too. But certainly over the last 20 years in the cultural sector, you've seen a shift in language from participation to co-creation. And so we define we call it the agency scale, where you've essentially got participation, which is about inviting people in to do what you are doing. So it might be an arts organisation or a local authority saying, hey guys, we're doing this. We didn't like to invite you to participate. And then co-creation is a shift because it's about saying, what shall we do? And how shall we budget it? And what should the decisions be? And you are making, as an organisation or a local authority, whatever, you're making those decisions 50-50, essentially, because the clue's in the title, it's co-creation. And then on citizen-led decision-making, you're actually handing over the decision-making to a community or to a group of citizens. And so that scale of agency shifts from participation to co-creation to citizen-led decision-making. And we always have to be really super clear that each of those is incredibly valuable as a method. In other words, one is not better than the other. They are very, very brilliant ways of working in different circumstances. But in the cultural sector, because of what Saad said about fundraising and narratives, people are always hungry for the next thing, and we include ourselves in this. It's part of how organizations, part of the economic reality of surviving in the cultural sector. It tends to mean that people, what we saw 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, was essentially a kind of inflation of language, that people dropped participation and started using co-creation, even though the methods and the decision making had not substantially changed. Now, I'm not talking about everybody, because there are lots of organizations that do brilliantly define the differences and keep that. But in general, there was this sort of soup of language. And I think that's why we bang on about authority gathering, sortition and deliberation, because exactly as Saad says, unless there's a conversation going on more widely in the deliberative sector about, standards, or what are the ingredients that are required in order for these methods to be real and to be genuine. And we think that's really important. The reason why this, tangentially relates to your question, Lucy, about what does it take for CEOs and for leaders, is because it's about zooming in to what handing over power and handing over control and being a different kind of leader from the sort of leader who, perhaps charismatically decides on a direction and everybody follows, to being actually what Saad and I talk about much more when you're a CEO, when you're a artistic director, as being a facilitator of other people's ideas. Now, obviously, you can see how that relates to citizens' assemblies, but it also relates to lots of other areas of leadership, relates to management of your team too, and how your team is supported and facilitated by you rather than directed by you. And so I think the big shift that people really, and this goes back to the start of the conversation, we were talking about rewiring brains, that a lot of people schooled in kind of conventional leadership, and I'm in control, I'm managing, and I'm responsible. Oh my God, I'm accountable for this whole organization or this whole department. People assume, because that's how we're taught, that therefore they need to adopt a certain set of behaviors and an approach which much closer relates to a kind of command and control approach, rather than something that is much more facilitative. So in short answer to your questions, I think it's a fundamental remodeling of leadership, people understanding leadership differently. And until people understand leadership differently, it's really hard for people to get their heads around why they might co-create or why they might use a citizens' jury or an assembly, because it just doesn't, it's like it doesn't fit with their assumptions around what leadership is.
And maybe just adding another layer to this in terms of rewiring your mind when speaking about leadership, when we talk about citizen-led decision making and the handing over of power. I would kind of challenge that in a way that as a leader of an institution, you still, even within this process, hold the power of the most important step. And that's where that authority gathering is so important. And that's the power of the question you are asking.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important as we're taking institutions and the cultural sector on that journey. Is that first, when we talk about engagement, there is no hierarchy. There are all like tools. You know, you have a fork, you have a spoon, you have a knife. They're all tools that help you to eat. And they're all useful in different situations. So again, when coming around that rewiring of the mind, we as a cultural sector need to spend also more time to understanding those tools, because they are so powerful when used at the right time in the right moment. And the challenge here is when you are looking at the tools outside of the funding and the trends that are and the noise that is happening all around. So again, within that rewiring, there is a balance. It's more adding to leaders than retracting from leaders. And I know at New Art Exchange, and it took us a long time, but the conversations I have with Adam, who is our executive director, and it took us time because believing and experiencing are two different things. We believed, but when you experience, something fundamentally shifts. And whenever we talk about the citizen-led decision-making framework that we brought in, we never speak about it, and we are very genuine when we say that when we brought that in, we gained more power, not lost more power. But again, that to engage with that in that shift, one of the things is that you can engage with it at scale because there is that learning period, there is that authority gathering, and it's a train that you drive as a leader that needs to have all the stakeholders in it. There is such a powerful and incredible tool that we have.
That's so interesting, because that often in other contexts, when we're thinking about why, so there's a lot of pushback from politicians, elected politicians, for instance, who are being asked about these methods or about citizens' assembly, and one of the key risks is I've been voted if I do this. It's you, the people, have voted me in to do this, and also those risks around loss of power. So it's very interesting. People feel that very keenly because they feel that they have been given the mandate by an increasingly small number of people, as we know, to do that. So I think it's very interesting to hear you say, as a leader, from your experience, you have gained power in a way by sort of this sort of way of working. And I'm sort of interested now perhaps to shift us to, perhaps we need to come back to that power question actually, and what you mean by that, because it's not in the traditional sense of, as David was saying, the big leader who stands up and says things and people do them. I'm interested, you also said, Saad, about seeing is believing, and the difference between thinking that this is going to be a great thing and sort of, I guess, intellectually, it's going to be a good thing, and then the experience of it actually happening. And I wonder if we can just shift a little bit. You've both been in or delivered or facilitated or commissioned. Now, you said you've actually commissioned an assembly process. I'm really interested to hear about what it's like in the room. What is it that creates this space in the room? What does it feel like? what do you see, observe the impact being on yourself, but also on the people who are taking part, who are facilitating, maybe who are funding? Can you describe a little bit for us what that's like?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that comes just into my mind is that is really that I suppose I'm an optimist in the sense that I believe people are amazing and people are inspiring and supportive and caring and loving, and people love more than they hate. But that obviously human history is sort of against me on that one in terms of like, weighing those two things up. In that, yeah, human history is against me on that. And so I suppose what for me, in very simple terms, being in an assembly or jury room is it confirms my belief that people are amazing. Because of the process that's used and the framework that's used, which is agreed by assembly members, but then also because of the deliberative nature of the dialogue. And it, for me, it confirms that possibility of essentially of lots of love and care and support and also innovation and ideas and better decisions because of the fact that it's a deliberative process, just because so much of our daily lives, but also our working lives, particularly, is based around debate. Debate's the formal way in which we make decisions. Obviously, it's the way we make decisions through politicians and in Parliament, but it also actually is the same way we make decisions in boardrooms. All the boardrooms I've certainly sat in have all used debate. So the idea of ideas being put up, strengths and weaknesses being analysed, a winner and a loser, conflict-based, even though in polite board meetings there might not be an appearance of conflict, there's absolutely an underlying sense of conflict. Therefore, huge power dynamics in those rooms, boardrooms. I love watching board meetings. I mean, their most kind of horrific acts of violence, I think, happen in those conversations that are totally quiet and incredibly politely delivered. But debate is a cruel form of a way to make a decision. It may have values and uses when you want to make a decision super quick or whatever. But in terms of what it does to people, who gets left behind, I think it's incredibly, and that is how we just generally, that's how society operates, by using debate. So when you go into a citizen's assembly or jury, for me, because you're in this deliberative environment, which is not conflict based, which is about listening, is about learning, is about actively giving space, actively seeking understanding, also actively exploring differences. In a board meeting, when there's a difference, somebody comes in with a kind of left field idea, there's a sort of panic around the board table of how they're going to politely kind of squeeze that idea out. Obviously, I'm exaggerating to make the point, but nevertheless, that I think I've seen that happen hundreds and hundreds of times. Whereas in a deliberative environment, that difference is brought to the center of the table. So those ideas at the periphery actually become important to the solution. And I think that's what makes them, that's why the decision-making process is better, because rather than pushing out those ideas which are awkward or tricky or difficult for the core board to understand, actually those ideas are brought to the center. So for me, in simple terms, it's like, it's about love. It's like what that woman who wrote that amazing book, Politics Without Politicians, has recently said, that she just, and it helped distill that idea for me, that she went into assemblies as a qualitative or researcher, expecting to kind of gather all this information and data, and was just really struck by sort of the idea of love and the idea of people, all of the things that come with love, and then all of the things that come with hate. So for me, that's probably a really romanticized answer, but for me, it confirms that people are amazing. It just because of the way that it's done, it enables us to be amazing. Because I just think we're all, some systems, most of our systems, encourage us to behave. It's like game theory, encourage us to behave as the worst possible version of ourselves, to imagine what the other person is going to do to ruin our life. And so we have to work on that basis, where citizens' assemblies and essentially deliberation requires a completely different way of thinking and a completely different way of treating each other. And so therefore it becomes so much more of a positive outcome, positive process.
Yeah, amazing. And that amazing woman is Ellen Andamore.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
whose book is obviously creating a lot of interest and impact. And as you say, for an academic, actually the approach being of learning about love through this process is it's clearly had a big impact on her as well, in the way that she thinks about and explores assemblies and deliberative democracy.
Yeah, maybe just taking it from this point. It's quite interesting. I think my first reaction walking into a room with so NAE works with its citizen assembly as 40 people from our neighborhood, and really walking into that room on the first day and looking at those people and just realizing that this is the biggest challenge of this country today, is people who are different live in a world where the system is all about divide and about hate and about celebrating everything that puts us apart. And that is not only when we work around that challenge as a cultural sector and we talk about citizen assemblies, etc., the challenge is way bigger. The challenge today that we have is, what is the UK of today? What is England of today? And we, by bringing those citizen assemblies into the room, that is us bringing something that politicians and all the country is struggling to do, is creating a story that brings people who couldn't be as different around one mission of togetherness. And I think that is the shift that I've seen within the 9 days of those 40 people, of the conversations that I had with them in the beginning, which were all about how different they are, all about fear, all about othering, and how those conversations shifted from day one to the final day, where they were all the same behind one mission, is that that place, whoever you are, whoever you vote for, is the legacy you are going to leave to the next generation. And to me, that is the power of citizen-led decision-making. That is the power of shifting from political debate to a deliberative citizen-led vision on a micro level for NAE and Hyzen Green, for the cultural sector, but even for bigger. What is England today? What is this country today? And it is a country of diversity that needs reconciliation. And that reconciliation, to me, is what the cultural sector should do. And its most powerful tool today is bringing communities and citizens behind it. And that goes back to those 3 principles that are, again, and I just wanted to put it in a scale that to me, the impact is really, really wider than just cultural institutions, cultural sector. It's about narrative, it's about who writes the narrative, and it's about who we are today.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. And bringing us back to thinking about, I guess I'm always interested in, so there's the network, which is working, with a bunch of cultural institutions and organizations and leaders in the cultural sector, and doing lots of stuff to share those learnings beyond those who are in this sort of first stage directly involved in the network. But I guess there's a really interesting question for organizations. These things cost money, there's budgets, there's there's all sorts of reasons why doing this is hard, right? Aside from understanding and knowing the process. But I'm very interested in where's the smallest, sort of the biggest small place or the smallest big place that people could start to explore this, or to think about how to bring elements of this into their work or to their practice or into their organizations or into their leadership, in fact. And so I'm curious about like where do you see the potential for this? We can see it on national scale as well. Saad, you've just referenced that as well, like sort of decision making generally, and clearly there's lots of potential there. But starting at smaller scale, where could people start?
I'm going to answer this because I'm going to talk about New Art Exchange, so it'll save Saad's blushes having to talk about it. But my feeling is that it's really interesting the way you've asked that question, Lucy, because you've brought in a really important topic, which is obviously cost and how much these processes cost. And I think often, in the conventional sense, they are prohibitively expensive for most organizations to run.
Yep.
And obviously, there's a tension here between the cost that they cost because they do what they do and they need what they need, and then diluting or watering that down to be lower cost, and therefore perhaps not delivering on those kinds of full standards. But I think what Saad has done, and I think he's like extraordinary in the whole of the UK. I mean, I'm a big fan of Saad, so he's extraordinary in the world. But I think what he's done at New Art Exchange, I think, is really interesting, and I think speaks directly to your question: what's the biggest, or what's the biggest, smallest thing that you could do? Which is actually, sometimes people think, oh, maybe what we should do is we should sort of try and have an assembly for a kind of project. And there are national arts organizations that are doing this. They're sort of saying, okay, well, we'll have a citizens assembly and we'll run it. And actually, I would imagine, I don't know because I don't know the budgets of those sorts of assemblies, but I imagine they're pretty expensive. I imagine they are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. And they act and work like a project. And this isn't just in the cultural sector. This is across also different, I would say, across the third sector. You've also got other quite big national charities that are doing this. What Saad did, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is say, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually put this right at the heart of the way that we lead the organization. In other words, we're not going to do a kind of project with a sort of time scale and a question which might or might not change who we are and what we do, but actually we're going to change our leadership and our governance structure. And so what Saad did at New Art Exchange is essentially create a kind of 3-pillar leadership model where you have the leadership, the executive team, you have the board of trustees because NAE is a charity, but also you have an assembly, you have a citizen-led representative group of people making decisions. And by doing that, you actually also, in the way that New Art Exchange has done it, you also actually reduce the cost. And that said, you'll be able to say this and more accurately, but I've heard you say, to do this and embed this and run the assembly on an ongoing basis inside the organization, it essentially is the cost of what might be a kind of senior sort of manager type member of staff each year. Now, nobody's been made redundant at New Art Exchange, but just in terms of an equivalence, I think that's really useful because as somebody who ran an organization, Battersea Arts Centre for many years, the thought that you could potentially take one role and have all of this massive benefit, all this collective intelligence, all this better decision making, all this relevance, and Saad can talk about what's happened at New Art Exchange, but in terms of like the strengthening of the business model, the greater financial resilience the organization now experiences, the greater legitimacy the organization has massively in its local community, but also nationally. All of that for that kind of cost is pretty extraordinary. And so in a way, so I just wanted to dive in with that example, because in a way, the kind of big, small thing, a lot of people I think would say, well, why don't you try it in a particular place or a particular project or a particular way? My fear is when you do that, it actually costs more. And the risk is that you don't fully deliver on what comes out. And actually, Saad and I would say, as we say across the network, the most important thing that we can do as a Citizens in Power network, the number one thing is essentially have citizen-led decisions that are implemented. The process don't ultimately, it doesn't matter. All of the things we've just talked about doesn't matter unless actually the stuff that people say when they come together and have this conversation that we've all just described, unless the organization or the parties or the actors go on to deliver that, we'd be better off not doing those processes at all, because you're just breaking trust at an even greater or higher level, in this case between charities and local communities. But as Saad says, that can extrapolate to anything. And so what's really brilliant, I think, about what Saad has done is actually say the biggest, smallest thing we can do is embed this in the organization and change the way that the whole organization works. And we can do that in an affordable way for us as an organization, but we can also do that in a way where then we are completely held to account by those citizens. And it's amazing. I think New York Exchange is like in 9 months or a year has delivered like 60-70% of all of the recommendations that have come out and has a clear sort of timeline about how the others are going to be delivered. I suspect if you compare that to most other assemblies, that compares highly, like probably potentially even ridiculously favorably in terms of the commitment to delivery. So I think I think in the network, the biggest thing we can do is embed these processes. The biggest, smallest thing you can do is not to kind of think, or let's experiment with it, or let's learn about it over here, is actually to dive in. Moseley Road bar swimming pool seems like a good metaphor for this, 2 feet, and actually make it happen and change the way that the organization fundamentally works. Because actually it turns out, as New Art Exchange example shows, that you're better off doing that. All I've seen, and I can say this as somebody who doesn't work at New Art Exchange but sees other projects working, it's where people are fully embracing this as the approach and are embedding it for the long term. That's where it's having the greatest impact.
And actually, it's a nice way to come back, Saad, to something you said earlier about increasing power by doing this process. And I don't want people to think that what you meant by that was increasing your personal power by doing this, because I think what you were referring to is legitimacy, and the sort of that is the thing that shifts in the way that you have thought this through.
Well, look, I'm going to give an example. I like to use food in my examples just because we all connect to this, and it will talk hopefully in something that people can feel and understand in terms of what I mean with power and with sharing and how it does kind of empower. But if you had a business, let's say you have a restaurant and you want to open that restaurant in Hyson Green, in our neighborhood, I'd say that you have 2 ways to do it. One, within the kind of like usual leadership, and you have your main person, that's the cook, taking key decisions, and then you'll have the person who is looking after the book. And let's say that those 2 are metaphors of your executive and your board. One is making sure the compliance, you're keeping to the mission and all of that, and then you're kind of delivering. I would argue that that restaurant would close sooner, will make less money, would be less embedded and less missed if they close, compared to another one where you still have your book, you still have your chef, but instead of the chef creating the menu, the chef brings in citizens around the neighborhood to decide what that menu is. That means that your menu is more relevant. That means that your menu is going to sell more, is going to be attractive, but you still retain all the great power. Because remember why you're here. You're here because you love cooking. And there is nothing better if you're a cook than when you cook something that people will love. That people will love. That to me is a really simple way to put it in. So forget about citizen assemblies, forget about all of these words. It's just embedding citizen-led decision-making, community-led decision-making, user-led decision, however you want to make them. But you do have 3 players around the table. Unless you involve all of them to play their role, that end product is going to be irrelevant. And when we are going to hit the next crisis, you are going to be irrelevant. So this is a battle for relevance. And it's go again beyond just those tools. We as a cultural sector, we get always cut first. So this to me is a vital work that we need to do, because there is a difference when you go out and say, we are so important, you need to invest in us, versus our communities the people who are behind us going out and saying that for us. And that vitality can only be speaking about itself when you embed citizen-led decision making. Once you start talking about citizen-led decision making, I'd say citizen assembly is one tool to do it. A citizen jury is another tool to do it. You could do your panels in so many different ways, as long as you go back to those principles that we said earlier. You have some kind of random selection. You can do it. You don't need to pay sortition. You can do it internally. You can put names on a hat and choose out of that hat. You have your authority gathering, meaning you get the key people around the table and you articulate your question with accountability. If you ask people to choose A or B, you make sure that you deliver. And you have deliberation to make sure that everyone's voice is heard and is shaping the recommendations that will always live within a spectrum. And it's, again, if you look at it on a big scale, that would have been the difference between coming to the UK and saying, do you want Brexit, yes or no, a divide that will last for generations, versus you come to this population and say, what kind of relationships do we want with Europe? And therefore, everyone has a voice. That divide now lives within a spectrum, and we can have that grey area as the one leading us forward.
Thank you. Such richness to think about and explore, and I love, Saad, your the way that which you talk about this being citizen-led and how you just build it into your team. And I think it's really helpful actually to think of it as it's just a role, because that makes it so much more achievable. It gives it, instead of feeling overwhelmed at the scale and cost of a process, you're fundamentally going back to actually where we started, why you got talking about these things, which is the gap in terms of leadership and what organizations need to thrive, to cook great meals, and for everyone to be satisfied, including the cook in that process, I think.
And it also just means that your investment can grow as the organization grows.
Yeah.
It can shrink as the resources shrink if you lose funding. But fundamentally is the culture of citizen-led decision making that needs to be embedded.
Yeah. I feel like that's a really great moment at which to wrap our conversation, and so much in there. And thank you so much for taking time out. Talking to you both is always a complete joy. So and there's always lots to talk about. So I will say thank you very much to both of you, and maybe we could just do a little wave to everyone to say thank you, and have a good rest of day.
You've been listening to another Democratic Future by Democracy Next. My guests today were Saad, Eddine, Said and David Jubb. If you want to find out more about Citizens in Power, you can visit their website, citizensinpower.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can find more conversations about democratic innovation and the deliberative wave at demnext.org, or by subscribing to our Substack, LinkedIn or YouTube channels. I'm Lucy Reid. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.